Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. This is our first and hopefully a series of Ukrainian voices. My name is Diana Price, and I'm here with Vanessa Sallow. We're both with Alexandria Library, and we are so excited to have joining us with us today Oleksandra Povoroznyk. She
Hi.
is a journalist and translator, and she is joining us from Kyiv, Ukraine.
Yes, hi. It's lovely to be here. And thank you so much again for inviting me. The fact that Ukrainian voices still don't really get heard, I don't know, like quite enough, is a huge pet peeve of mine because, we're shouting at the top of our lungs sometimes, and sometimes we still get ignored. So it's wonderful of you, and I do hope that that this won't be the last video you make, and that more Ukrainians with various experiences will be able to tell their stories, because we are a quite a diverse and different crowd, I'd say. So yeah, for inviting me. And today I'll be talking about EuroMaidan, because once again, it's a topic that gets not nearly enough attention, I'd say, but also it's always sort of surrounded by conspiracy theories, and there's a lot of things that people get wrong. Either they could be acting in bad faith, good faith, but still there's a lot of misconceptions. And as someone who's been through those events, as a student, as a protester, and someone who can see the fact that they have influenced our history in a great deal. And I go as far as saying that what is happening now in Ukraine is sort of directly influenced by Euromaidan, and it's sort of an ongoing continuing struggle against the Soviet legacy and Russian imperialism. So I think in order to understand what's happening in Ukraine right now, you do need to go back to Euromaidan, maybe even a tiny bit further. Luckily, Ukraine hasn't, well, luckily, Ukraine hasn't been independent that long. So, there's not much history to talk about. So I won't be going back too long. I won't bore you with the historical details. But I do think that, people need to know about the struggles that Ukrainians have been going through their entire lives. I do think that that's something very important. So I think, whenever I talk to strangers or foreigners about, and I happen to do that a lot because I'm very active on Twitter. Sometimes I regret that. But I do try my best to educate people on what's happening in Ukraine and what has been happening here for quite some time. So I think a lot of people sort of misunderstand Maidan. They sort of see it. I mean, of course, there are the conspiracy theorists who say that it's all a coup, and it was organized by the CIA or whatever. But there's also other people who see it as some sort of far right riot led by, I don't know, like nationalists or things like that. There are other people who just sort of downplay the importance of these events, who feel like, yeah, there were uprisings, there was unrest, but ultimately, Ukraine doesn't change. It's still very corrupt. And I'd like to, address some of these sort of opinions and sort of tell you about the events and how I believe they shaped our history and led us to the moment where we are today. I think something that a lot of people seem to misunderstand is that, Ukraine, I'm not going to argue that Ukraine isn't a corrupt country, because it is. But I think something that people misunderstand is that Ukraine and Ukrainians have been fighting against corruption, for the past 2 decades, for the entirety of our independence. Corruption in Ukraine was, it was a result of the Soviet Union falling apart, and sort of these social norms which were upheld in the Soviet Union, and these laws and the rules and everything, and the even social hierarchy it all went crumbling down. And, in the end, the people who were ruthless, the people who had connections, the people who, who were, thugs, essentially, they tried to get, their hands on all of these resources, anything they could grab, essentially, even now, Ukraine has issues with, with this lack of weapons to defend ourselves because, in the 90s, in the early 2000s, a lot of corrupt Ukrainian officials would just sort of sell these weapons, just take them apart, sell everything they could. And, they bought themselves into power. They, built political careers. They became oligarchs. And, for a while, that was what our society looked like. And, you might think that not much has changed over the past years, but, looking back, even I'm guilty of this. I think that, we haven't made that much progress. But then, looking back at the, events that happened in the early 2000s, at the fact that, journalists were being murdered, there was political assassinations taking place, there was a huge amount of police brutality. I realized that, we are making progress. In 2000, in the year 2000, Ukraine was, the most probably horrific event in recent Ukrainian history was the fact that, our government had, our then president, had a prominent anti-corruption journalist, assassinated, and his body was found in the woods. And, it was a horrific event. And our government back then and the first couple of presidents were, they were thuggish. They weren't that different from Putin or Lukashenko. They were very closely tied to the Kremlin. And, it was an issue up until 2004 when, the first Maidan happened, the Orange Revolution, which pretty much it led the foundation for the EuroMaidan of 2013, 2014, because back then, a lot of Ukrainians felt that, the elections had been stolen from them, and they probably were. One of the political candidates was, there was an attempt on his life. He was poisoned, he survived it, but, his face was horribly disfigured. And, the people, they revolted. It was a peaceful, completely peaceful uprising. And eventually the government, they gave in, re-elections were held. But, a lot of people after the fact, they were sort of disappointed because, Ukraine stayed the same, not much changed. And in the end, in 2010, the guy who was accused of poisoning his opponent, Viktor Yanukovych, who was a man with criminal ties, even worse, a man with the past of a petty criminal who was involved in assaults, and there were jokes about him, starting his political career as just a thug who robbed people in the streets and stole hats from them. He suddenly became president, and for a while it felt like like Ukrainians had given up on this idea of changing our society. Like a lot of people felt that nothing could be done, that Russia's influence was too strong, that the post-Soviet influence was too strong, and that our society couldn't really transform itself. And it was a dark time back then. And for a lot of people now in the West, they see Viktor Yanukovych, this thuggish president, as sort of a pro-Russian figure. And the truth is, it was a lot more complicated than that, because he had ties to the Kremlin, but a lot of people, both in Western and Eastern Ukraine and in the South, they voted for him because he promised stability and sort of, he said, okay, there'll be corruption, probably, there might be some sort of there might be, political assassinations or whatever, or if, journalists make too much trouble, they might up dead in the woods. But the rest of us, we're going to have normal, happy lives. We're going to be, we're not going to be too pro-Russian. We're not going to be too pro-Western. We're going to, stay in the middle, and we're all going to live happily. And that's something a lot of people voted for. But also as part of his program during the elections, Yanukovych promised that he would eventually, lead Ukraine to a very sort of gradual integration with the European Union. There were no huge promises, but the idea was that, we'll still have good relations with Russia, but eventually, we want to move to the West. We want to have good relations with the European Union. We want to eventually, maybe not have to have visas when we travel abroad, all of these things. And a lot of people, didn't really care about that. They just wanted the stability thing. They just wanted, to have no more revolutions, no more uprisings. But some people, especially among the youngsters, the people who had, whose parents had come into some money maybe in the 90s or, after the 90s, who'd traveled abroad a little, who wanted to maybe study abroad, eventually, a lot of these people, they felt like moving towards Europe would be a good thing. And it wasn't just because there were, nationalists who hated Russia, or, because we have those too. We've always had those for, reasons. And the reason is, our shared history with Russia. But, a lot of people, they just sort of saw Europe as, as a way to get a better life. As, that we thought that, okay, if we sign agreements with the European Union, then, our lives will get marginally better because, maybe then our government will have to sort of ease up on the corruption and, our businesses will be able to export things abroad and, we'll be able to travel without, waiting in line to get visas, and we'll be able to, study abroad and things like that. So for some people, especially the younger crowd, especially the urban crowd, they felt like, it would be a good thing. And the weird thing that happened in 2013 was that, Yanukovych, who had promised that he would sign this agreement with the European Union, he went to the signing ceremony. He traveled there, and after, hours and hours of diplomacy and discussions, he suddenly announced that he wasn't signing it and that he would instead sign a trade treaty with Russia. And, people were shocked, not the entire country, but students, the sort of the politically active people, the youngsters, the, mostly university students or high schoolers, their parents, university professors, they felt betrayed. And, they probably nothing would have happened. People would have probably just, grumbled about it on Facebook. And and nothing more. But a Ukrainian, an Afghani Ukrainian journalist by the name of Nayem, he wrote a now iconic post on Facebook, which which is going to be in history. It probably is in history books already. He logged onto Facebook and he wrote, if you're really unhappy about our president sort of betraying, not keeping up his promise and betraying these ideas of, moving towards Europe, let's go to Maidan, because Maidan, even, then it was, it was used as sort of almost a meme, because after the Orange Revolution of 2004, whenever people would be discontent with anything, they would sort of jokingly say, everybody to the Maidan, like, let's protest this. But when Mustafa Nayem wrote about this on Facebook, and he was a public figure even back then, he was famous for writing about corruption and things like that. He was very outspoken, still is. And, he wrote on Facebook that, if you're really unhappy about this, let's go to Maidan, It was November, it was cold. He said, bring blankets, bring hot tea and thermoses, bring your, good mood. Let's show our government that we actually care about this. Because, for a while in Ukraine, I think it's almost similar to what's happening in Russia now, although obviously, their case is a lot more serious, is that, people got so disappointed in their government, in their president. They tried to change things. It didn't really work out, or it didn't happen as fast as they thought it would. And they sort of felt like, okay, we're not going to deal with this. We're not going to protest anything. Maybe the next guy could be even worse. So, it's not going to change anything. Let's just stay. Let's let things stay as they are, and that's good enough for us. And a lot of people, at this moment, they thought, okay, let's actually show our government that we care, that we're noticing these things, that we do have our own opinions. And so in Kiev, on the 21st of November, 2013, a lot of people went out to the Maidan, the central square in Kiev, which is, I don't know if any of you guys have seen this, but it's a huge sort of square. It's very empty. It's not like I don't know, a lot of squares in American cities or in European cities, but because of the Soviet sort of views on architecture, it's just very grand, very sort of empty. There's a lot of space to spread out, and people went there. They spent the night there. They chatted, and they decided that they'd come back the next day. And I was a second year student back then. I was 19, and so I didn't go there on the first evening, but my then boyfriend's parents did. And a lot of people I knew did. Some of my professors did. I joined the sort of the protests on the second day, and it was it was very peaceful. It was sort of, looking back at it now, it was kind of naive, really, because a lot of these young people, students, they came there with their homemade posters and and their tea, and they sort of stood around and they sort of waved flags and they said, hey, we're angry about this, but it was very, very peaceful. And probably looking back, it would have ended, it would have ended in a couple of weeks. Nothing would have happened, probably, because the majority of people, even in Kiev, they sort of felt like like these youngsters were just walking around with their guitars and their sort of drums made out of cans or whatever, and they were yelling or singing these songs. And a lot of people felt like you couldn't change anything with that. It wasn't realistic. Not a lot of people were expecting that if 1,000 students gather and shout something about wanting to join the European Union, nobody seriously considered that the government would be like, okay guys, sorry, we'll go back and we'll sign that agreement. So it would have probably sizzled out in a while. But for some reason, Yanukovych didn't wait for it to fizzle out. For some reason, he decided that, that serious measures had to be taken. There are theories that, this decision was influenced by Putin, maybe, he sent the riot police, the notorious Berkut, which was, even then, it was sort of the stuff of legends, their brutality, and they were the guys who were who trained together with the Russian riot police. They were sort of known for being very tough and very cruel. There were all sorts of semi-legends about about them having red hats because allegedly you had to kill someone to get that red hat, or things like that. So they were very, very feared. And, Yanukovych, instead of waiting for these protests to sizzle out, he sent, a bunch of these very tough riot police guys to rough up the students in the middle of the night, because, people were, they would go to Maidan during the day, but they would also, spend the night there, sort of thinking that, if we don't stay the night, then maybe sort of the government will barricade the Maidan off, and maybe they'll do something else to chase us away from here. So we're going to spend the night. And it wasn't that cold. People would go there in with tents and things like that, and hot tea. And so at 4 a.m. in late February, late November, sorry, these handful of students were sitting around and just sort of talking or sleeping or whatever. And the riot police, unannounced, with no warning, they go in there, they chase everybody, out of the square. They really rough up the students. Luckily I wasn't there because, a lot of us just would spend the night there, and, like the most idealistic of us would spend the nights, and we would just, in the evening, we had homework to do or whatever, and we would go home and come back in the morning. But, next morning I wake up, I go to university, and, everybody's in a panic, everybody's horrified. My university professor comes up to me and says, like, hey, are all of your friends okay? Are you, in contact with them? Is anybody missing? And, people are just freaking out because these kids, who were, I don't know, from 16 to 25, they got beaten up really badly. Some of them are missing, some of them aren't picking up their phones. It's horrifying. And, because Maidan, at the beginning, these protesters were mostly students, a lot of their parents, live all over the country, and, they can't get in touch with them. They're panicking, some of them are already driving to Kyiv, everybody, that's, just like what everyone was talking about on the streets. And if before that, a lot of people, especially from, I don't know, the older generation, they would sort of be very skeptical about Maidan, and they would, sort of say like, okay, whatever, protesting, that's probably a teenage thing to do, go ahead, whatever. Now, it wasn't about the songs or the posters. It wasn't about the European Union. It was just a state of horror that, the government that we had, had distrusted, but which hadn't really turned against us on such a scale, that it was willing to, to maim these kids, who were unarmed, who were absolutely peaceful. I mean, of course, throughout the 90s, throughout the early 2000s, there had been this sort of acceptance that, that occasionally journalists who poke their noses into something suspicious, they might, get tortured, or they might get, disappeared or whatever. But, a lot of people felt like, politics are a dirty business. So, if you mess around with that, if you go up against someone powerful, then okay, you probably had it coming. So, it's sad, it's horrific, but, what can be done? But now, the government and, the riot police was attacking kids who were absolutely peaceful. And, people were horrified. And honestly, I don't know what Yanukovych's reasoning was. Maybe he thought that it would frighten people. Maybe he thought that, these parents would say, hey, no, you're not going to Maidan anymore. It's too dangerous. You're staying home, whatever. But instead, on the 1st of December, thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, they just flocked to Maidan. Even my parents, who had been, slightly skeptical at first, or they thought, okay, you want to be a political activist, go ahead, whatever, just be home in time for dinner, or, or even just don't spend the night there, because I was already living on my own as a student. But, even they said, like, no, we can't tolerate this, because this is horrifying. This is too much. So the next day, people who weren't really interested, who didn't really care about the Euro integration stuff, they flocked to the streets, and it was amazing, because I don't know, there's a lot of numbers going around. Some people say that there were 1 million people there on the 1st of December. Some people say that, probably it's couple of 100,000. But, and as an illustration of that, I went to Maidan on the day after the protesters were beaten up, with my parents, their friends, my friends, their parents, and, accidentally in this crowd, I accidentally bumped into my grandparents, who I didn't, think they would go there. It was surprising. And, you would see all sorts of people there, your university professors, your neighbors, and people from very, very, very different backgrounds, and sort of with different political opinions. They sort of flocked to the square and said, you know what, we are not backing down. This has to end. Again, you know, had our government sort of, I don't know, said that, you know, the riot police hadn't been given these orders, actually they were acting on their own or whatever, or I don't know, apologized somehow or back down, maybe this wouldn't have escalated further, but they didn't. And, you know, so people started sort of, I don't know, it's not even that people started building a community, it's sort of that a community started sort of gradually building itself up from this protest movement. Because, you know, as the days got colder, people started bringing tea, and, you know, and people who had medical experience, they would bring sort of first aid kits and set up sort of, you know, these tiny little hospitals, you know, in case the riot police came back and would beat someone else up. People started building barricades. People started, you know, making hot meals. Our, you know, university professors, they sort of semi-officially would hold lectures there, you know, for anyone who was interested. You know, one of the first lectures was held by Serhiy Kvit, who at the time he was president of Kyiv Hill Academy, where I studied, and he would later go on to be our Minister of Education. And, you know, he would hold lectures there, and, you know, people would set up, you know, sort of homemade libraries, would bring, you know, books and stuff to keep themselves entertained. And people would start, more and more people started spending the nights there. And, you know, the colder it got, the more determined people were to, you know, keep this thing going. Because there was a sense of sort of rising pressure. There was a sense of, you know, if we back down now, then, you know, our future will be like, I don't know, Belarus or Russia, you know. And, you know, so we couldn't do that. But there was also this fear of, you know, of what would our government do in response to these protests. And again, you know, the government, instead of sort of backing down, they, you know, they try to outlaw any kinds of protest activity. And, you know, and people just ignored them. You know, they started building, they knew it was dangerous because, you know, occasionally these sort of the riot police would come back and they would just hose people with cold water, you know, in the middle of December. And people, you know, would build barricades, you know, to keep them out. And they would, you know, take care of one another. You know, it was very weird because I would, you know, obviously our parents and our friends and everyone was, you know, we worried about one another, but we couldn't back down, you know. So I remember making sort of a deal with my dad that, you know, I wouldn't spend the nights there, but because they were considered to be the most dangerous, but, you know, he would go there during the nights, and during the day I would hand out, you know, hot tea and sandwiches, things like that. So everybody sort of did what they could. And, you know, and this movement, it sort of kept growing. And the more cruel our government got, the more sort of people self-organized to sort of help each other. I mean, it's really weird because currently in Ukraine, you know, whenever a politician or someone is accused of corruption, or, you know, or something fishy happens, people start, you know, rolling their eyes and say, like, you know, what was Maidan for? That was all for nothing. But when you actually think back on, you know, how our society looked during Maidan and before Maidan, you see, you know, you see a huge difference because, you know, it's just, you know, looking back, you remember that, you know, people would sort of self-organize to, you know, to go to hospitals and to watch over the people who, the activists who had been wounded and had been taken there, because there was this fear, and it wasn't ungrounded, that, you know, that the police would come and kidnap them and, you know, and you know, hurt them or kill them or whatever. And, you know, despite the fact that obviously our government is not perfect now, you know, when you look back at these things and think like, hey, that wasn't that long ago, but I remember the police kidnapping people, wounded people out of hospitals. And I remember, you know, news about their bodies being found decapitated in the woods after that. So, you know, when you look at it, you know, through that lens, you think, oh yeah, we have come, you know, quite far. So yeah, and people would self-organize to protect themselves. They would teach self-defense. They would, people who had cars and, some free time on their hands, they would patrol the streets to make sure that, nobody was getting kidnapped. Nobody, was, they would sort of fight back any way they could. People with medical degrees, they would set up hospitals, to take care of wounded people, because obviously they didn't trust, the state-run hospitals. People would look out for one another. And the weirdest thing was that, that really Europe and the Euro integration thing, it didn't really matter at that point, because, there were very, very different people joining all of this, because, um, I was a student back then, so I remember all of these sort of student communities from my university, which were very, very diverse and which had, had always been fighting each other. They were suddenly working together. Like, you would see these very conservative, sort of far right guys suddenly, uniting with the anarchists and sort of doing something together. You'd see, people from all over the country, people with really, really different views. Like, the ultras movement, the football fans, the football hooligans, they had a large role in that. And, the football hooligans that supported different teams, opposing teams, they would suddenly somehow unite and work together. And, it does take extraordinary circumstances to get, people from opposing football hooligan, I don't know, units or whatever teams to work together. And, that's what happened. And, and as the days, they sort of grew colder, and our government was doing more and more to, sort of stop the protests. And, they continued trying to, bully people into stepping back. They would do, horrifically awful things just, to send a message, mafia style. They would torture activists, or, just kidnap them, or blow up, people's cars and things like that, and in return, activists would sort of, arm themselves with, I don't know, kitchen mallets, or I don't know, or whatever, or just planks, and they would barricade themselves off in government buildings. They would, because, Maidan, it's in the very historical center of the city, and it's surrounded by all of the government buildings. People would, take them over. They took over the Kyiv city administration. They chased out everyone who was working there. They barricaded themselves there, and they said, no, guys, we're not coming out until you listen to us. And yet again, our government refused to listen. And, you think, where do you go from here? From, beating up essentially kids, to torturing activists. And, somehow it got even worse, because in February of 2014, they decided for some reason that, what would really help things calm down would be, getting snipers to shoot at protesters in the streets in broad daylight. So, they did do that. And, it was even more horrifying than anything that happened before that. There were snipers sitting on the roofs of buildings in central Kiev, just shooting people to kill. And, it was horrific. And, a lot of people, obviously, the people who, a lot of the younger people, or the women, or, a lot of us, they said that, if you're not sure, you'll know what to do in a situation like this. You have to leave, you have to go home now, because, it is getting even more dangerous. And, and yet people stayed. And, even weirder was the fact that, people from all over the country kept coming into Kiev and joining the protesters. And, a lot of people had military backgrounds, or, or were just, braver than me and, the average person. They would, knowing that, these horrific things are happening, they would go there. And, and people kept marching, and kept standing there. And eventually, after more than 100 people were killed, Yanukovych suddenly said, okay, let's try and have a truce. He suggested a truce, and probably knowing that he wouldn't have a very bright future in Ukraine, he just packed his bags and fled to Russia. And after that, I'd say that, after that, everything was over and everyone lived happily ever after again. But unfortunately, no, because, that's when we come into today's events. Because, at the moment when, Ukraine was still sort of burying the people murdered during the Maidan, and, there was this sense of confusion and sort of horror and also victory, at the same time when we didn't even have a proper government because there was an interim government and, we were set to have elections, suddenly, these weird green little men appear in Crimea, and these weird things start happening in eastern Ukraine. And, it's obviously Putin used this sort of moment of confusion and horror to, to attack us and to, to steal parts of our land and occupy them, which was very weird. And also, it's funny because you see, photographs from Donetsk or Luhansk in late 2013 or early 2014, and there are people, thousands, hundreds of thousands of people supporting Maidan there with Ukrainian flags, with European flags, and then practically overnight these suspicious figures appear out of nowhere, with no identification, and suddenly, suddenly there's a so-called uprising against the Ukrainian Nazis or whatever. And obviously that was not sort of an organic development. That did not happen by itself. But yeah, and after that, again, to going back to the idea that that EuroMaidan was sort of a coup d'etat, and the government was overthrown to install a puppet government. Well, we had very transparent elections for the first time in a long time in Ukraine after that. And Petro Poroshenko won them with a sort of more conservative, I'd say, Euro-optimistic, but also slightly nationalistic sort of platform. He won those elections, and then he served a term, and then, Zelensky won the elections after that. So, that would be a very weird, thing to overthrow a government and then hold elections and then hold other elections electing a second guy. But yeah, but even, even though a lot of Ukrainians still occasionally grumble that, Maidan didn't change all that much, looking back, it did change quite a lot. And I think that, Maidan is also a great reflection of the fact that, as disorganized as Ukrainian society can be, in times of really awful peril, it sort of comes together as a whole. Because, when at the start of the full-scale invasion, a lot of people from the outside were sort of surprised that, suddenly Ukrainians who hadn't really been all that united, before that, they were suddenly all working together to fight off the invaders. And, to that, I want to say, well, hey guys, come on. We've had this experience already of, people from very different backgrounds, suddenly bonding over Molotov cocktails and things like that. So it did show us, and it hopefully showed the world, that, that we can come together and work together and achieve great things, even in the face of absolutely horrific danger. But, it's also, I think it was sort of the beginning, of the war in a sense, because, it just starting with Maidan, Russia and Putin, they sort of felt like Ukraine was slipping out of, their grip, and that we wanted a different future. And, at that moment, they sort of, started trying to drag us back in. But also, Ukraine, I think that obviously if Yanukovych were still president, or God forbid. Obviously now, we probably have the same issues as Russians do, in the sense that, uh, we sort of managed to fight off tyranny, when it wasn't as strong as it is in Russia now. So, who knows what would have happened if Maidan hadn't happened then. But, it's even now in Ukrainian sort of, it's already becoming sort of almost folklore, in the sense that, these are events which are, so emotional for so many Ukrainians, and they are so symbolic. And yet, we've all lived through them. And it's very weird when you think of, the fact that, my generation, or people slightly younger than me, they've had to spend their entire lives, fighting for something. And, a horrific example of this is Roman Ratushny, he was a young guy who was, I think, 16 when EuroMaidan happened. His father before him was a prominent activist. And so they were two figures that were very popular during the Maidan movement, because, they were helping people organize things, and they were very active. And then, Roman was 16 back then. And when, during the first year of the full-scale invasion, he was 20 something, he was 24. And, and he joined the army, and he was murdered last spring. He was killed in action. So, I think that's a demonstration of, of what our current generation of Ukrainians is having to deal with. We're just, people who've had to spend their entire lives fighting against something or for something, be it against corruption or for our freedom. But yeah, I don't know. It does sound slightly depressing, but I hope it also sounds kind of a little hopeful, because societies do change, and it's weird, because you never think that, as a kid, you think that you want to live through historical events and and be part of something greater than you are. But then these events come along, and it is a little taxing to be actually living through them. But yeah, Ukrainians are kind of unlucky in that way, that we are living through historical events, whether we like it or not, and we deal with them as best as we can. I've sort of galloped through the sort of the historical events, but maybe you have questions. Maybe I could focus on something a little more in depth.
Sure. Thank you, Alexandra. I think that is the best summary of EuroMaidan that I have ever heard. I know that we did get some news coverage of it in the United States, and from what I remember, it did not do a good job of explaining what was happening. And I think that now that since then there have been many protests in the US, we can kind of see a pattern of the way the news covers protests. Because I remember they showed a picture of Maidan Square after the protest, and it was like, looked like something very bad had happened, like burnt down, and it was very like, look what protests do. And instead of really having a kind of in-depth take of what had happened and why. So I think your recollection of events and explaining how this happened and how it affects what's going on today is just so valuable. So thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you so much. To be honest, Ukrainian media didn't do a great, job of covering it during the protests. But, as a society, again, something interesting was born out of that, because, because most of the news channels, the big news channels, they belonged to oligarchs back then, obviously. So they didn't really, cover it that well. And so people, sort of wannabe journalists, or, people who are studying journalism, they just sort of, started filming themselves and sort of making live streams and streaming the whole thing. And eventually, that was how, certain news outlets, which are now, probably the most respected in Ukraine, like Hromadske, which is, our really big broadcaster, which is, very well respected. That's how they started. And, like most of their journalists, their biggest names, they started by essentially, streaming their own experiences of Maidan. And so, it is interesting how great things are born out of horrific, awful events. But also I do think that all around the world probably, and especially I'd say in Russia and in Belarus, Maidan has been used as sort of a horror story to show people that no, protesting is bad, because protesters, they vandalize things, and they break storefronts and things like that, and that's bad. And it is weird how just if you take Ukrainian society and Russian society, because at the fall of the Soviet Union, obviously, we did start similarly, except that Russian society was way richer than ours. I think it's quite illuminating to see that Ukrainians, they see Maidan and the heavenly hundred, the people who were murdered by the snipers, as something, as a national myth, as something to as the sort of golden standard of being a good citizen, whatever it takes. And Russians have sort of, in turn, thanks to their news coverage of all of this, they have sort of managed to use the term Maidan and turn it into a very ugly slur. They use it to sort of describe no good troublemakers who are just willing to destroy everything. And I do think it is interesting, the sort of the fact that other countries and their sort of civic societies, some of them learned a lot from what happened in Ukraine, some of them didn't. So it is sometimes interesting to reflect on that and see how different people responded to it. So yeah, and I am happy, very happy that that now the news coverage is a lot better. There's still some things to work on, but I think when looking back at Maidan, I don't really think I saw many interviews with Ukrainians back then. And thankfully, people are finally listening to what Ukrainians actually have to say about themselves and about what's happening. So that's very nice. I do think that's yet again an illustration of of the fact that sometimes when we think that the world around us isn't changing for the better, it actually is. We just have to reflect back on the horrific things that happened before and think thank God that is not happening anymore. So yeah.
Do you think that like the rise of social media and people being able to share their own stories on kind of a wide scale is helping with media more accurately reflecting what is happening in events around the world and in Ukraine?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think it's a double-edged sword, obviously, because I spend way too much time on Twitter, and as a very sort of at a moment in time when I'm very emotionally fragile, obviously there's a war going around, but it's, on the one hand, it's great that social media lets lets your voice be heard, and that's incredible, because you can directly address misconceptions that are going around on the internet. I started my Twitter thing because because I kept seeing these sort of very odd takes from people whose whose main qualifications were that they were that they had spent a year as a Moscow correspondent, and then they went back to the US or the UK or France or whatever, and they spent all the time on their high horse looking down at us and saying, oh, well, I think that Kyiv's definitely going to fall in 3 days. Yeah. So there were these takes, and it's amazing. I think a lot of Ukrainians actually took to social media and started using social media in English to sort of address that, sometimes make fun of these takes and give their own versions of events, and it's wonderful because occasionally even mainstream media, they sort of catch up to that, and they start asking people from Ukraine amazing. That's such a groundbreaking idea, to ask people from Ukraine what's actually happening there. So it is good, but also, I do think it's kind of weird that, I'm pretty sure that, we're probably the first generation of people to be, living through a very horrific sort of war of conquest, and, just a war of, I don't know, colonialist aggression, to be, sitting in basements during air raid alerts, hearing explosions outside our windows, and, and then, you log on to Twitter to sort of to blow some steam off, and then, you see these like hundreds of tweets about the fact that, it's all a lie, there's no war in Ukraine, and, it is weird. I don't know what those things are doing to our sort of collective psyche, because it really can't be good when, when you're living through a war and also getting harassed on the internet for living through a war. That's not fun. And I do think, I got my bachelor's degree in sociology, so I'm very curious to see, if there'll be any sort of in-depth works or studies done on that, because I do think it's a very sort of weird phenomena that's happening. But so yeah, it's a double-edged sword, because on one hand you get a lot of support, and I think also, a lot of people, a lot of wonderful foreigners really are treating this war very personally, and, they're seeing it as something, to be emotional about, because, they're able to connect with Ukrainians on social media. They're able to see that, we're just human beings, and, we have, the same interests as anyone else, and, usually we live normal lives, and, but obviously not now, but, and I think it does help people sort of sympathize with us more, and and not just see us as statistics, on a screen. But, also at the same time, I don't know, it is slightly horrifying that there are, whole communities of people who are for some reason building their entire online presence around harassing and bullying, people going through a literal war. So it is very weird. But, also, social media has helped us so much to self-organize, and the same way it did in Maidan, because I remember during Maidan, people would, if people needed to take care of someone who was wounded, they would use social media for that. And, people would, who had, cars and time or whatever, they would take them to the hospital, things like that, and it was a great time to, cooperate. And, in a similar way, I think a lot of people, even now in Ukraine, are fundraising for Ukraine, or helping people get what they need. And it's a global thing now, because, there are whole communities that are helping us out, or doing fundraisers, or doing, wonderful, wonderful things. So it is great. And I do think it's quite hopeful to think that, social media, which, I think in the recent years, it has been sort of seen as this sort of awful, totalitarian, sort of horrific nightmare thing that, that keeps us locked in a matrix or whatever. But actually seeing it being used for good, and seeing it being used for empathy and things like that, it is incredibly uplifting. And, and it's wonderful to have our voices finally heard, because, as Ukraine has been a colony, a Russian colony, for a huge part of its history, and our voices haven't really been heard, much, because, for a long time, our, everything from our food to our artists to our historians to everything, it was often appropriated. It was often, repackaged as something Russian, because that was, seemed more palatable for, a Western audience. And now we're finally reclaiming a lot of that stuff, and we're finally speaking up, and, we're finally sort of talking about our experiences. And I do think it's great. And I do think it's it's wonderful, especially when people from other sort of marginalized communities, or, or just communities that have had to fight for their independence, when we sort of get to compare notes and sort of, and sort of see, hey, what was your oppression like? And it's amazing because throughout my entire life, I've always sort of been interested in Ukrainian history, but I've never really spent that much time delving into Central Asian history and the history of the indigenous peoples of Russia and things like that. And now a lot of activists from different backgrounds are sort of linking up on the internet, on Twitter or whatever, and sort of talking about, hey, how was your experience as a Russian colony? Mine was awful, thanks for asking, how was yours? So and finally these people who haven't really interacted all that much, we're finally sort of talking about our experiences, and it can be very therapeutic. So yeah, it is wonderful. And the international community, it's just so amazing that finally we don't feel like we're alone in this. And it is important. I know it sounds like not much, but really the fact that people from all over the world are for some reason reaching out to Ukrainians or donating or or helping or doing these incredible things. It's it's amazing because back during Maidan we mostly felt like we were alone with this monster, just locked up in a room with this horrific dragon which was trying to eat us all, and everyone was just watching from the sidelines. And now we feel like we do have support, and it has been incredible. I think that a lot of us would have lost our minds just from the thought that we're alone in this and we're up a much stronger neighbor. But the fact that the international community does support us and that people do care, it's incredible. So and also thank you guys for doing this, because it's amazing. It's it really does warm my heart every time people genuinely take interest and not treat us as as just something to write a theoretical column about about why Ukraine should definitely reach a peace agreement now and leave thousands of people under occupation. So yeah, it is wonderful when our voices are heard.
Um, Segues into my next question is, I know that a lot of people do want to help Ukraine and to donate, but sometimes it's hard to know what organizations are actually helping Ukrainians and are actually in Ukraine. And because I know that some claim to be, and then
Yeah.
I've heard from Ukrainians, they've never seen them, they don't know what they're doing, they don't think they're actually helping. So are there any organizations that you would recommend people look to donate?
Definitely. Okay. Again, this is, I know that some people don't want to donate money to organizations they think are too military, or they don't want to donate to the army. As Ukrainian, I mean, obviously it's everyone's right, to donate to whatever cause they see fit. But, as a Ukrainian, I do feel like, donating to support our army is probably the best way to support us, because, it's, they're saving lives. Come on, they're saving lives every single day. And, also, as a Ukrainian, I think sometimes that, the Western media, they sort of draw a very sort of firm line between Ukrainian civilians and Ukrainian soldiers. But the fact is that, Ukrainian soldiers are Ukrainians the same as the rest of us. And, they're, every single Ukrainian has either family in the army or, friends or, neighbors, our colleagues. I have, like so many people I know and love who are currently on the front lines. And so I do think that if you're worried, I know it's obviously difficult to convince people about this, but yeah, as a Ukrainian civilian, I do strongly feel that donating to our military is the best way to support us. And probably if you're looking for something in that direction, then I would definitely suggest checking out Backhand Alive or Povoroznyk Живим, which is it's, I think, the first, I don't know if it's the first charity organization in Europe or in Eastern Europe, but it's one of the first charity organizations worldwide which has an official sort of official rights to buy weapons, which is an interesting illustration of our times and the times that we live in. But they are doing incredible things to keep Ukrainians safe. And they're huge. They're probably the biggest charity run by Ukrainians, and they're incredibly well known. Their reputation is just absolutely flawless. But also, if you want to do something else, I would suggest going to 24 UA, which is the government initiative, the official one, which is you can see it on Zelensky's web pages and everywhere. It's the biggest. It's huge. It is very big, and they're very transparent, and you can choose the causes you'd like to donate to directly. So yeah. But yeah, I do feel like sometimes it is again a pet peeve of mine when people say that they don't want to donate to the army, but they would donate to rebuild things, or or to help the wounded. And here I am sort of mentally screaming into the void that the less people donate to our army, the more we'll have to rebuild things. You're just we'll just have to rebuild more things later. So yeah. But also I think talking about Ukraine and sort of keeping an interest in what's happening here is incredibly important, because I know that not everybody can donate, and and a lot of people think that they care, but they don't feel like they're doing enough to help. But honestly, the thing that most Ukrainians are scared of right now is that the world is going to tire of all of this and just sort of move on and leave us alone again with this monster. And it's great that people don't seem to be doing that, although we're still very afraid of it. And so each time people write about Ukraine, or or talk about it, or tell their representatives that they care about what's happening here, it is hugely uplifting and hugely important to us, because it is very scary to be all alone with that. And luckily now we have more support than ever, and hopefully hopefully that will be enough, and hopefully we'll have more support, and this horrific experience will end, and we'll all be thinking back on how that experience changed our society. But yeah, so anyway people want to support Ukraine, it's great. I do suggest though sort of donating to local initiatives, because the big organizations, they're often the big international organizations, they're often very bureaucratic, and it does take a long time for the money to trickle down to Ukraine and get converted into aid or whatever. So if you're in doubt, probably see what organizations Ukrainians are donating to, because they do get the job done much quicker.
I will say also, if you're in the DC area, in Silver Spring, there's a Ukrainian festival every year, and they have been taking donations for the army and for soldiers since the invasion of Crimea. So that is what I've been donating to every year. And that particular booth at the festival is a secondhand table where they also take donations. So you can find some beautiful secondhand Ukrainian things. And they also have a lot of people who are selling things that are direct from artists in Ukraine. So that way you can support a Ukrainian family or a Ukrainian artist directly through your purchase there.
Wow,
that's
really nice.
Thanks. All right. Thank you so much, Oleksandra, for joining us today. It looks like we're at the hour. And thank you everyone for watching.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much.